everyone for being here today. I think it was Isaac Newton who said that if we see further, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. And there were a great many giants who helped make today's presentation possible. So I want to start by acknowledging and thanking them. I first want to start by recognizing the authors, many of whom you will see a lot of their studies and best practices integrated throughout my presentation today. So I wanted to recognize them. And in particular, I want to shout out Cal Newport, whose book Deep Work planted the seed for this research topic when I read his book last summer. I also wanted to thank and recognize the executives who took time out of their busy schedules to allow me to interview them for this project. Many of them are on this call today. And of course, I want to thank the many Kellogg professors who went out of their way to help me craft this presentation and to put it in the final form that I'm about to present to you today. And finally, I want to thank the one and only Professor Brooke Vukovich, who was my advisor on this project and who from the beginning has just empowered me to pursue my curiosity on this topic, and whose unending wisdom, brilliance, and intellect inspire me and so many other members of the Kellogg community on a daily basis. So thank you. Before I begin, I just wanted to let you know that I am eager and excited to answer any and all questions you have for me after this talk today. We will be using a program called Slido to do that. And so at the end of my presentation, I will have a slide that will have a code that you can enter to ask me questions. And with that, let's get started. I'm here today because if someone were to ask me to list the attributes I would most want others to associate with me, I would put productivity high on that list. I once told my husband that when I die, I want him to carve "She was efficient" on my tombstone. Because from a very young age, I have been obsessed with productivity. I've never wanted to do just one thing. I wanted to do 10 things at the same time. But over the first decade or so of my career, I started to notice something. I was feeling not just tired, but exhausted by the end of the day. Sometimes I would come home and fall asleep not on my couch, but on the floor next to my couch. At dinner, my husband would ask me what I had done at work that day. And although I knew I had flown from one activity to the next, I truly could not recall one single thing that I had accomplished that day. My health began to diminish as well. I started waking up frequently in the middle of the night. I gained 10 pounds. And slowly I began to realize that I was burning out. And picking up my head and looking around me, I realized I was not alone. Because never before have we lived in a society that forces us to be on all the time as much as the society that we live in now. How often has someone said to you that he stayed late at work until 9 p.m. last night and you felt guilty that you left at 5? How many times have we measured how hardworking someone is by how few hours of sleep that person obtained the night before? Why is it more impressive to tell someone that you're tackling 20 projects instead of saying that you're focusing on just one? We live in a world that, as the former CEO of Baxter International, Harry Kramer, puts it, values activity over productivity, and in which we measure one another's work ethic not by what we actually accomplish, but by how busy we are all the time. The problem is this hustle culture is starting to catch up with us. The average American workday is no longer 8 hours long, but is closer to 10. In 1942, the average American slept 7.9 hours per night. Today, that average is 6.8. Called the epidemic of the modern workplace, burnout is now classified as a disease by the World Health Organization. Workplace stress amounts to 8% of national healthcare costs in the United States, and it costs 120,000 deaths annually. I am here today because I do not believe that we have to sacrifice our health for the sake of profit. Instead, I believe that by working with our brains rather than against them, we can make the pie bigger, both for ourselves and for our organizations. This is what I believe, that what we want for ourselves, our teams, and our companies is performance rather than unending activity. But to achieve that performance, we are going to need to change the way we work drastically. So what I want to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking with you about today are 3 myths that I believe we are telling ourselves that are preventing us from being truly productive as a workforce. They are: first, that productive people multitask; second, that more hours equals more output; and finally, that we should be collaborating all the time. To reiterate, these myths are false, and today I'm going to tell you why. So let's start with why it's wrong to assume that productive people multitask. And to begin this section, I want to start with a story. Thanks to my dad, I am a big Star Trek fan. And for those of you who may have also seen Star Trek, you may remember an episode in which Data, who is a human-looking android, goes on a date with a fellow crew member. And I promise you, I'm 100% not making this up. In the episode, her name just happens to also be Jenna. So Jenna and Data are on this date, and Jenna looks up at Data and asks him, "What are you thinking about?" She's imagining he's going to respond with something very romantic. But instead, Data looks down at her and he says, "In that particular moment, I was reconfiguring the work field parameter, analyzing the collected works of Charles Dickens, and considering a new food supplement for my cat's Spot." Now, I think we can all agree that Data would be a total buzzkill on a date, but the fact of the matter is we all try to multitask like Data all the time. The average American worker receives close to changes focus close to 20 times an hour and receives close to 60 interruptions in an 8-hour period. Now, if we were good at multitasking, this would not be a problem, except for one issue. Our brains are terrible at it. Because while it's physically possible to do 2 things at a time, fMRI scans reveal that it is physically impossible to do 2 tasks at the same time with a high level of quality. This is because our brain works in a very linear and logical fashion. It likes to tackle one task and process after another, because each process in our brain involves complex manipulations of billions of neurological circuits. So when we try to hold more than one thing in our brain at a time, our memory degrades. Let me repeat that again. Our memory degrades because our brains are either switching back and forth between 2 tasks, or they're attempting to divide and conquer. So now you might be thinking to yourself, well, these switching costs sound kind of small, but let me share some statistics with you that might change your mind. A study out of the University of Michigan found that it takes us on average 23 minutes and 15 seconds to return to a task once we've been disrupted, and that this cannibalizes 40% of our daily productivity time. Another study out of the consulting firm BaseX found that on each day, American workers waste an average of 2.1 hours due to unimportant interruptions and distractions, and that this costs $588 billion in lost revenue to US businesses annually. Finally, a study out of the University of London found that when we multitask, we lose an average of 10 IQ points, which is like trying to come to work and trying to make complex decisions while simultaneously consuming 2 glasses of wine per hour. So what should we be doing instead? Well, I think we need to start by treating our brain like a muscle. Prior to Kellogg, I was really into CrossFit, and each year I would watch the CrossFit Games on TV, and I would say to myself, this year I'm going to become the next CrossFit Games champion. So the next week I would try to go to the gym every single day, and without fail, by day 5 I would either lose my PR because my muscles were so fatigued, or I would pull something and be burnt out and, out of commission for weeks. Because, in sports, if you strain your muscles without allowing them to rest in between, they will burn out. And the same can be said for our brain, because our mental performance has biological limitations. This is because our prefrontal cortex, which controls the executive functioning part of our brain, was one of the last major parts of our brain to develop. And because it's relatively new in evolutionary terms, it's very energy hungry. So when we try to use this part of our brain, all day long, we begin to suffer from what's called decision fatigue. And the results can be quite alarming. I'm sure many of you are familiar with a study that was published by the National Academy of Sciences that found that judges awarded parole 65% more at the beginning of the day than they did at the end of the day. Because as humans, we cannot make the same rate of complex decisions all day long. What we want instead is what psychologists refer to as flow, which refers to a state of full immersion in an activity with zero distractions. A recent study from McKinsey found that when executives work in flow, they are 500% more productive. So what we want is we want to find a rhythm between flow and recovery for our brains. And we're lucky because researchers at the Drawdown Group actually calculated this rhythm down to us to the minute. They found that all-star workers alternate between periods of 52 minutes fully engrossed in their work with no distractions, followed by a 17-minute break. Researchers have found that we only have about 3 to 5 hours of flow in us on a daily basis. So if we truly want to work with our brains, we need to schedule different blocks of time for different modes of thinking. There are several research-based strategies that can help us do this. The first is that we need to schedule attention-rich tasks for when our minds are fresh. Now, I really do, I wish I could tell you exactly what time of day this is, but each of us has our own unique biorhythms. Each of us is different. Some of you out there are larks, some of you are owls, some of you are something in between. But what matters here is that you schedule your hardest tasks at work to overlap with when your brain is most alert and fresh. The second strategy I want to tell you about here is called batching, which refers to grouping similar tasks together so that you don't end up repeating them more often than is necessary. So for example, in a given day, if you batch all of your meetings together into one period, if you batch all of your communication exchanges, like your cell phone, your email, instant messaging, etc., into another period, and then you batch together all of your time and flow into a separate period, you end up increasing productivity because you don't lose time due to transition. And finally, we need to automate as many decisions as possible. Former President Barack Obama was famous for never having made a decision regarding his meals or his outfits in the Oval Office because he knew that making those decisions would diminish his mental capacity. And while unfortunately, at least I don't have staffers who can pick out meals and my meals and outfits for me, we can still act as our own staffers and automate those tasks so that we don't need to use our prefrontal cortex to make those decisions. So for example, you could meal prep one day a week. You could pick out all of your outfits for the week on a Sunday night. You could use email templates. You could schedule exercise to recur at the same time each day. These are all ways to automate decisions that your brain would have otherwise had to have made on a daily basis before. Now, let's look at someone who is masterfully applying these techniques. Carter Cast is a professor here at the Kellogg School of Management. He is also a venture capitalist and is the former CEO of Walmart.com. You will see that Carter Cast is for sure a lark. He is most alert and attentive early in the day. So he blocks off a 3-hour period between 6 and 9 a.m. to work in his period of flow. And during this time, he focuses on his hardest, biggest priorities for the day. And Professor Cast shared with me that during this time, he completely powers down his phone. He disables all notifications on his devices, and he declines all meetings for this period so that he can ensure that he's fully focused on these projects. He then does a magnificent job of batching for the rest of the day. You'll notice that he only checks his email and phone in a 1-hour period in the morning between 9 and 10 a.m. And that he then batches his meetings together in the late morning to mid-afternoon. He also sets time at the end of each day to write down what his priorities will be for the following morning's flow period. And then he has a strict cutoff time of 5 o'clock p.m. Now, before I wrap up this myth, I just very briefly want to talk to you about how our environments affect our ability to focus and or multitask. A recent study out of the University of Glasgow found that 100% of participants performed better on highly demanding cognitive activities when they worked in silence. So this means for an open office environments, we need to establish rules and procedures for how and when we can interrupt one another. And second, and of course this is a very timely topic given that the current world that we're living in, study after study has shown that remote work not only diminishes the average of 200 hours in commute time that American workers make to get to work each year, but remote work has been shown to significantly increase productivity and workforce engagement. So what I want you to take away from this first section is that it's not that productive people multitask and do 10 things at once. It's that productive people unitask, one priority at a time. Let's move on to the second myth, which is that more hours equals more output. Of course, the objective of any business is to extract the maximum amount of output per employee. And this used to be really easy to calculate because according to Cal Newport in his book Deep Work, in the industrial era, we simply counted what was visible, which was the number of widgets created per unit of time. Yet as the world has given rise to greater and greater automation, more people than ever before are being paid to think. The problem is we're still relying on the variable of time to measure our output, which is an archaic and inadequate way to measure someone's output in a thought-based economy. Yet because this is our performance measure, our workforce, instead of spending their time focusing and thinking critically, now feels pressured to signal that they are working at all hours of the day. For example, a colleague recently shared with me that even though sleep is so important for the brain, she would sleep with her laptop next to her at night so that she could get on at various points in the night to check and respond to emails from her consulting firm because she felt so pressured to signal that she was on and working 24/7. Now, you might be listening to me and saying, well, Jenna, that's very sad, but does it really matter how many hours we're working if we're still generating the same amount of output? The problem is that by pressuring our employees to signal their work to one another all the time, we are burning them out. A study from the American Psychological Association found that 550 million workdays are lost due to stress on the job each year, and that this amounts to a productivity loss of $500 billion to US businesses on an annual basis. Another study from Gallup found that 53% of American workers are currently unengaged at work, and that burnt out employees are 2.6 times more likely to be seeking employment elsewhere. Now, the cost of these trends is significant because employee turnover costs US businesses $600 billion annually. I also hypothesize that at a macroeconomic level, this signaling is stunting our GDP growth. As we know, innovation is a critical dimension to economic growth. An economist here at Northwestern, Robert Gordon, recently wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of American Productivity. And in his book, he writes that between 1750 and 2004, humans created inventions which vastly increased our productivity. Things like the engine, the airplane, the internet, highways. But that since 2004, GDP growth in developed economies has slowed. And Gordon predicts that this is because, whereas our prior inventions saved us time, our newer inventions, like our cell phone, for instance, are consuming our time. Another element that goes hand in hand with this is the idea of social capital, which is that if we trust each other as a society, we therefore feel more comfortable taking risks, and this gives rise to greater and greater innovation. But anyone out there who's ever tried to talk to someone else while that person is simultaneously emailing or texting on his or her phone knows that the very devices that were meant to help us connect often push us further and further apart. So in other words, while our newer technologies have the potential to open up space to allow us to innovate, we're simply not letting that happen. Now, this is a pretty dark moment in my presentation, so let me become a little bit more solutions oriented. What should we be doing instead? I think we need to start by redefining what performance means. We need to be measuring the quality of someone's work rather than tracking where that person is at every hour of the day. And in order to do that, we need to empower our employees to focus. Because as I've already shown you, focus is a limited, vital resource, and we can't afford to waste it. To do that, we need to help our employees block out time to focus on their priorities. One of my favorite quotes is from Peter Drucker, who says, "There is nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all." And we know from the Pareto principle that 80% of our effects come from just 20% of our causes. Yet even still, we have become obsessed as a workforce with tackling 1,500 projects a day instead of focusing on the vital few that matter most. Now, I know that being intentional about the way we work and setting our priorities is not a revolutionary way to work, but the fact of the matter is, so few of us are truly intentional about setting our priorities on a daily basis. So to do this, there are two research-based strategies that I recommend. The first is that you should write down your priorities before you start your day. Because as the experts say, once you open your email or your cell phone, you're going to default to someone else's agenda other than your own. Second, we need to block out in our calendar long periods of time to work in flow. The way most of us currently schedule our time is we try to squeeze in our important work around meetings and communication exchanges. We need to flip that model on its head. We should be blocking out large chunks of time to work on our greatest priorities for the day, and we should then be scheduling meetings and communication exchanges around those periods. Another way that businesses can help their employees do this is to block out and put boundaries around their employees' work days entirely. According to Parkinson's theory, work expands so as to fill the amount of time available for completion. So when we draw a line in the sand that says all work stops here, we force ourselves and we force our workforce to focus on the most critical tasks at hand. Now, I know this sounds kind of counterintuitive, but let me point you to a study that was conducted by Microsoft in Japan in the summer of 2019. That office moved to a 4-day work week and found that productivity during that period increased by 40%. And as I begin to wrap up this myth, I just want to highlight one more unconventional way that we can think about how to protect our employees' ability to focus. We need to allow our employees to rest. We need to stop labeling breaks and vacation as lazy or unproductive time. And my favorite story to illustrate this comes from the Spanish painter Salvador Dali, who insisted that when he would hit a block in his creative process, he would sit in a tall-backed wooden chair, and then he would take a pair of heavy metal keys and he would hold them in his right hand. He would then take a dinner plate and he would put it on the floor beneath his feet. And then he would try to take a nap. And just as Dali was falling asleep, he would drop the keys, they would hit the plate, and Dali would sit up. And Dali insisted that at this exact moment, it was when he had his greatest creative breakthroughs. And I know this sounds crazy, but researchers have found that over 40% of our creative ideas occur during breaks. This is because when we're actively working, our conscious mind runs the show. And as I mentioned earlier, our conscious mind is very linear and logical. But when we're resting, our subconscious mind takes over. And our subconscious mind is very good at breaking down linear thinking patterns and pulling together information from different parts of our brain that was inaccessible to us when we were actively working. So if you've ever had a brilliant thought while you were brushing your teeth or taking a shower or out for a walk with your dog, this is why that happened. So instead of sneaking out for a lunch break or feeling guilty that we want to stretch our legs in the middle of the day, we should be embracing breaks as a workforce because they lead to greater creativity and greater innovation. So what I want you to take away from this part of our discussion is that it's not about working 20 hours a day. More focused attention leads to greater output. Let's tackle this last myth, which is that we should be collaborating all the time. According to research from Adam Grant, the average American worker spends 80% of his or her time on their phone, checking email, or in meetings. And of course, collaboration is a wonderful thing, but collaboration without true purpose is what experts refer to as collaboration overload. Because this leaves just 20% of our day to focus on critical individual work. And I argue that is an unbalanced and unproductive way to work. Often, I think we are checking our communication tools not because we actually need them, but because we are addicted to them. Make no mistake, our communication tools like our cell phones, instant messaging, our email, were designed to foster behavioral addiction. Our brains are wired to be social, and they're also constantly scanning the horizon for something new. So when we get a new instant message or a new email or a new text alert, our brains reward us by giving us small hits of dopamine. But this is actually very concerning for our workforce because when we over-communicate and use these devices too much, we actually create too much electrical activity in our prefrontal cortex and we overstimulate the brain. So what I want us to shift to is a society in which we use these tools only when they're useful. Instead of trying to resist them all day long, they should be made available to us when they're most helpful. And according to the law of behavioral change, if we want to break these bad habits, we need to do one simple thing. We need to make them invisible. So turn off notifications on your instant messaging system. Turn off notifications on your email. Put your phone on silent. And most importantly, experts recommend that if you really want to work in flow, your phone should be in an entirely different room than the one that you're working in. We also need to consider how our brains operate during brief moments of downtime during the day. Scientists refer to the period between two tasks as a decision point. And even during moments of 3 seconds, our brains are wired to crave social interaction. So during decision points during the day, we need to ask ourselves if we're actually doing what we should be doing or if we're simply defaulting to our brain's social nature. For example, say that you just got out of a meeting and you have a check-in with your manager in 5 minutes. Most of us would take out our phone and get 6 or 7 emails out of the way. But arguably, both for the brain and for the efficiency of that meeting, that's not what we should be doing. What we should be doing is reviewing our notes for that upcoming check-in and settling on what our main points will be. So that when we enter that room, our brain will be focused on that activity and we can be more efficient and purposeful in that conversation. Now, as I begin to wrap up this last myth, I just want to highlight one more theme that I think is hurting our productivity. And I've called it the Bermuda Triangle of productivity loss because it involves instant messaging, meetings, and our email. So let's start with instant messaging. We need to question why, as a workforce, we have developed an expectation for 100% synchronous communication. And if there's anyone who can help me make an argument against the expectation for an immediate response, it's Jason Fried. He is one of my personal productivity heroes. He's the author of a wonderful book called It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work, and he is the CEO of the software company Basecamp. Jason shared with me that he believes that synchronous communication diminishes his employees' productivity. Because as Jason puts it, when 2 people are instant messaging, the person with the question gets something out of that exchange. But the person who had to reply had to drop what he or she was doing to provide that information. And Jason feels that this is rarely, if ever, a fair trade. So at Basecamp, unless it is truly an emergency, Jason tells his employees that it is perfectly fine for them to fully unplug and work in flow on their greatest priorities, and that they should return to instant messaging only when it's convenient for their schedules. Now let's talk a little bit about meetings. A recent study from Bain found that the time we are spending in meetings has been increasing by a rate of 8 to 10% on an annual basis since the year 2000. 73% of us multitask in meetings, and meetings waste on average $37 billion in productivity costs in the US annually. There are so many best practices for meetings that I probably could create a part B of this presentation and give a whole lecture on that. So I've just settled on sharing just a few best practices with you today. First, every meeting should have an agenda. Meetings should banish devices, and they should be short and small. And second, meetings should never, ever, ever be used for updates. Updates can be written and read before people even walk into the room. Instead, meetings should be used for what they are best for: discussing, debating, and decision-making. As I close this myth, I want to end by talking about email. As I went through this research project, book after book, I became more and more convinced that our email was eating away at our daily productivity. So to explore this hypothesis, I used data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics and data from McKinsey. And I pulled just an average salary of someone working in the business and finance sector. For this model employee, I found that every email this individual sends and receives across his organization costs 70 cents of that person's salary. And that this amounts to a cost of $22,000 in that person's wages allocated to that person's inbox annually. Now, I am not saying that email is not an essential business tool. Of course it is. But what I am saying is that we would gain significant productivity back if we diminished the number of emails that we were sending across our organization. Again, there are many, many best practices to do this, but I'm just going to share two with you today. The first is that we should default to not responding unless we need to, because responding only generates more emails across the organization. Second, we need to keep emails succinct, we need to make them easy to read, and we need to include all relevant information in an email the first time we send it. So what I want you to take away from this last myth is that it's not that we should be collaborating for the sake of collaboration, but that we should be balancing collaboration with individual effort. Now, I wanted to amend these myths into truths that you can carry forward with you into the workforce. So let me share them with you now. First, productive people unitask. Second, more focused attention equals more output. And third, we should be balancing collaboration with individual effort. In closing today, I want to say that admittedly, it has been a very interesting time to examine productivity in the modern workplace. I think that this pandemic is going to create permanent cultural shifts, and I think that it's caused many of us to question some of the ways in which we used to work. For example, I think that our workforce is going to move permanently to a more remote working environment. And I genuinely believe that is going to be very good for our productivity. But that shift alone is not going to banish our addiction to our devices, our tendency to multitask, or the pressure that we feel to signal our work to one another all the time. We have a choice about the type of world we want to work in. We can either continue to work in a world that is burning us out, or we can have the courage to demand a world in which true performance, rather than unending activity, can win. Thank you.